important meeting of the entire year for neurology. We invited 80 to 90 of our peer speakers to Boston, those patients that you all know that speak at our live events around the country. And the purpose of the meeting is training and getting them up to speed on content and things like that. But really what the weekend is all about is storytelling. They get to hone their own stories, they get to hear stories from their colleagues and their peers, and the rest of us get to be energized by everything that comes out of their mouths and just being around these incredible people. Because if you're a stranger walking in off the street and you see this room of people, and you ask them, well, what do these people all have in common? Of course, the simple answer is going to be, they're all MS patients. But when you spend even 5 minutes with this group of people, what you realize very quickly is that these people, yes, they got a diagnosis months, years, even decades ago. But what makes these people consistent and unique is that they chose to stand up. They didn't just choose to stand up for themselves. They believe that there's a higher calling, that there's a purpose behind their diagnosis to help those less fortunate than themselves. And so when you listen to their stories, you can't help but be fueled by them. So what I'm asking of you today, because the first person going to come up here is Steve Wilhelm, a gentleman from the great state of Virginia, who was diagnosed more than 20 years ago, who lives in Virginia with his wife. They have a son who's a freshman in college. Steve started his own advocacy group, already has over 200 members as part of the group. And he's been speaking on behalf of Biogen for a number of years now. He happens to be taking Tecfidera. But I want you all to do yourselves a favor for the next hour. Forget about incentive comp, forget about share goals, forget about paying your taxes or what you're going to be doing this weekend, and live in the moment. Because after you hear from our patients, after you hear from the caregivers that support our patients, you can't help but be energized by their message and their passion behind everything that they believe and everything they care about. So please join me in giving our first speaker a warm Biogen welcome, Steve Wilhelm.
Comment about the taxes was kind of funny because as part of my travel plans, I brought my federal taxes to do while I was in the plane to work on it and to finish. My name is Stephen Wilhelm. I want to thank you all for having me here tonight or today. And my goal today is really to try to bring back to you all some of the focus and purpose as to why you all do your jobs. And that focus and purpose is for the patients. You know, I've had MS for 22 years, and when I talk about the disease to other people, I generally say I can relate to all the various categories of symptoms, with the exception of any kind of trouble I've never had with optic neuropathy, with my eyes or with my vision or anything else. But beyond that, most of the symptoms at one point or another I've experienced. For example, at times I've had enough difficulty with my legs and with my walking that I've needed assistance walking. There were a few relapses that I had where I lost a lot of arm strength and hand strength, and an average man has about 25 pounds of pinch between their index and their thumb finger, and mine was reduced to 2. And to put some context around that, 2 pounds isn't even enough strength to clip your own fingernails. So during that time period, I'd have to have my wife help me clip my fingernails. So when I talk about my disease to people, I talk about it in terms of my experience, and there's really 2 groups of people that I focus on. It's the newly diagnosed patient, and I want them to know as I talk that there are people out there who will help them. There are drugs, there are medications, there's a medical community, but ultimately, the course of this disease is going to be affected by some of the decisions that they make, some of them that they make early on. People who've had the disease a while, I kind of want to serve as a reminder to them, you know, you may be living with the disease pretty successfully or pretty well, but there's always room for improvement. There's always room to look at the way you're handling your disease and make adjustments when necessary. And I share that message with them really through my own story. And I'll give you an abbreviated version of that right now. When I was first diagnosed, it was in 1994, spring of 1994. In fact, I'd like for you to take a moment and think about where you were in spring of 1994. I was fighting an onset of a disease. When I was first diagnosed, my neurologist, who was a local small neurologist, he said, well, the best thing for you to do is to go home and wait and see what happens. Which at the time, because medicines were just emerging, was a pretty common thing to hear. And so my wife and I weren't satisfied with that, and so I went to Johns Hopkins and I got a second opinion, and they said, you do have this disease, but there are some things that you can do. There are new medicines that are on the market, and we suggest that you start on one. And so I did. I started on actually a couple of them because I went through them and I would have relapses about every 6 months. They weren't successful. I was having issues with the medications, and after a while I thought, well, I can kind of deal with these relapses. They're not so bad. And maybe I'll just kind of take my disease and I'll put it over here in the corner. And that's what I did. I stopped taking my medicine. I stopped kind of identifying myself as a person with multiple sclerosis. I stopped going to my neurologist appointments. So first I missed a few, and then I didn't like to miss appointments, and so then I just stopped making them. And I thought I could get along pretty well with that, because when I recovered, when I wasn't in relapse, I felt strong. And in fact, I did do well for a while. But after some time, I'd be walking down the street, and someone I'd see would ask me, well, how'd you hurt your knee? And the fact was, I hadn't hurt my knee. I was just having trouble walking. Or I'd be in meetings, and I'd realize that people were discussing things that we had discussed in the prior meeting, and I didn't remember the detail the way I once did. And so I realized I really needed to start making changes, because whether I wanted to deal with my disease, whether I wanted to keep it over in the corner or not, it was still progressing. And so I started to evaluate myself. Naturally, when you're in denial about something, probably the first thing you need to evaluate is your attitude, your mental state. And so I did that. And I can remember early on when I was first diagnosed, I knew I had the right attitude about it. In fact, after we'd come back from Johns Hopkins, I was in bed. I'd had a spinal tap, I'd had MRIs, I'd had all kinds of testing done. So I was in bed resting, and my wife was in the living room. And I could hear my wife talking, and what she was saying was something like this: why Steve? Why my husband? And at the time I was in the bedroom, so I knew she wasn't talking to me, but I still felt obligated to answer her questions. And so I made my way up out of bed. In fact, I was holding on to walls and furniture coming down the hall, and I found her in the living room where she was laying kind of in a prone position. And I got down and I comforted her. After some time, I kind of grabbed her by the shoulders and I said, listen, Rita, I know we're going to have a lot of challenges. But the truth of the matter is, something we need to understand right now is the question isn't, why Steve, why your husband? The question is, why not me? I'm a young, strong man. I can be a vessel who can carry this disease and be a good model for other people. And that's what I want to do, and that's what I shared with her. And I found myself having moved away from that position, and so I knew I needed to recenter. Listen, attitude affects so many things in our lives. It affects our happiness. It affects our motivation. When I have a relapse, I have to be motivated to get back into my normal routine, or it's going to be a disaster for me. It affects our relationships. My wife is a wonderful care partner. I joke that over the Christmas time, she made me some Christmas cookies. And I promise you that if I had had a bad attitude with her, I wouldn't have gotten those cookies. And it's a silly way of saying that relationships are important, and then start with attitude. The next change that I made was with ownership. As I've said many times, I had taken my disease and I had pushed it as far away from me as I possibly could. I had no ownership of it. I wasn't keeping myself educated. I wasn't doing the things that I should, and so I realized I needed to make change. I began studying a little more about my disease. I got more involved in the local MS community. And we're fortunate that we have a very big one in the city of where I live. I began to do smart things like financial planning, because there could be a day where I can't work, and I want to put myself in a position where I'm not always under stress, wondering how am I going to pay my mortgage. And so I made adjustments in those kind of ways. Those were all ownership issues. And I found that as I did that, I put myself in a better position to handle this disease. Two more changes I made was with diet and exercise. You know, having a good diet makes common sense for everyone. But the truth of the matter is when you have a disease and you're fighting anything that's chronic like this, the more that you do for yourself, including diet and exercise, the better off you'll be. And so I changed my diet to a diet that was full of fat and fast foods, to a diet that was high in things like antioxidants, healthy foods. This morning I had, some of the berries off the breakfast buffet. I did slip in 2 pieces of bacon. I love food. But for the most part, I try to eat relatively healthy and then add on some of those pleasure foods. And I found that as I lost a little weight, because I had gotten a little more in shape. I was trying to find a diplomatic way of saying that. Pudgy. I found that, when I'd have these relapses and I was carrying an extra 20 pounds, those 20 pounds when my legs were heavy felt like even more than that. And as I lost weight and I'd have these relapses and I was in a better shape and better condition, I found I did better. Same thing with exercise and strength and toning. I can actually go on for this for a long time because about 3 years ago, my walking was a disaster. I stumbled everywhere I went. And what I had learned was as I began to exercise and tone myself, I also gained a wonderful thing called muscle memory. So I started out at the gym and I was on the treadmill and I was all over that treadmill. I was hanging onto the rails. I was scaring the people around me because they were just waiting for me to fall and go down the belt any moment. But as I continued to do it day after day after day, these repetitive things, I found that in time I didn't have to check myself continuously on the handrail. And in time I wasn't going from one side of the treadmill to the other side, back to the other side, because I had no control of my feet. Instead I was beginning to go center. And within a matter of about a month and a half, I was letting go of that handrail and I was running for a solid 20 minutes without stumbling once. And so I learned that I could do this incredible thing, and that was replace some of the function that I had lost through my nervous system, because my nervous system still wasn't getting better, through another means, and that was through muscle memory and through training. And so it's an important part of what I do every day, really literally every day. 2 more changes that I made was I decided that I needed to get serious about the treatment of my medicine. I did that in 2 ways. The first way was I began to reestablish myself with the medical community. Again, when I disassociated myself with the disease, I also disassociated with the people who could help me. And I learned that as I was having these relapses, because I was still having relapses, I'd call for a Solu-Medrol treatment, and for a while they were pretty good about getting them to me quickly. But after some time, and I hadn't had an appointment in 1 or 2 years, or even longer at times, I'd call them up and say, hey, I think I need some Solu-Medrol. And their response was, we don't really know you. You're an inpatient to us. And I'll make your appointment in June. We'll evaluate it then. And I had really no one to turn to. And so I realized the benefit and the need for me to establish those relationships, and I did that. I found a neurologist who began to know me. I knew him. We knew the course of my disease and what to expect from it. When I needed physical therapy, he was my point man to send me out. And by the way, I think that exercise, and I tell patients that exercise and physical therapy serve 2 completely different purposes. I exercise whole body every day for my health, but I also still have weak areas, and I get PT for those, and I think it's a distinction that should be made. And so now I have this wonderful relationship with my neurologist where we talk through issues and items, and we weigh risk versus benefit on things like medications and things of that nature. And as I built that relationship with him, he began to tell me, Steve, you really need to get on a disease-modifying medication. And I would say, thank you. And I would shake his hand and I would leave his office. And for a couple of years, we were doing all the right things with the exception of me taking medication. And he never missed an opportunity to tell me that I needed to start on a medication. And I never missed an opportunity to thank him for his advice and then walk out on him. And one day, about 3 years ago, that really began to change. I was at work one day, and I noticed that the world around me started to kind of fade away, cognitively. Things became fuzzy, sounds became, I could hear them, but they weren't making sense to me. And at the same time, the right half of my body was going limp. And that lasted for a couple seconds. I went home that night, I told my wife, I said, something happened, it's new, it's never happened to me before, and it kind of scared me. Next day I went to work, not thinking it would happen again. It happened 3 more times. And so I started recording it, logging it in a notebook, how frequently it was happening. And in the course of about a week and a half, I was having about 30 of these seizure-like episodes a day. So I went and I got an MRI, started on Solu-Medrol treatment. The doctor confirmed the MRI. It was results of some new lesions. It's a pretty rare symptom with MS, but it's not unheard of. He said, Steve, I want you to start on a medication. I said, well, let's get through this first, and then we'll talk about it. That night I went home and I was trying to have normal conversation with my wife because we had talked so much about this new symptom. You know, her and I were both feeling it, but this is the beginning of the end. And so I was trying to really distract her from that for just a little while to give her a respite from it. And as we were talking, this normal conversation, I began to go into one of these episodes. And so like before, what was in front of me blurred out, which in this case was my wife. I went limp on my right side, and so I quickly grabbed a chair. And that lasted for about 15, 20 seconds as always. And then things began to come to, because it was like I would go down and I would fire back up. And as she came back into focus, I noticed that she had moved over me and she was watching me and she was staring at me in the face. And as I began to see her again, I could see that her face was frozen in fear. She was watching me go through this event. And it was scaring her stiff, literally. And it was kind of at that point where I realized, you know, I say I have this disease. I say I'm the one walking around with MS. But the truth of the matter is, there's a little part of my wife, my son, my coworkers who I'd been scared for the last week and a half to death, who also carry this disease too. And I felt like I was being selfish to myself, and that was okay, but I realized at that moment I was also being selfish to those people. And that was at the point in time when I realized I really need to do everything. I need to have complete ownership, and that means taking a medication so that I have the best outcome. So I called my neurologist the next day and said, you know what? I thought about it, and you're right. I want to make that change. And I share with patients what that was like. I also share with them a story on the flip side. As I reached my 20th anniversary for my MS, we gotten past this, I was doing well. I told my wife, I said, you know, I want to do something big to bring in these 20 years. And so we signed up for a race. And you know, years ago, all the fad in racing were triathlons, but these days, if you try and sign up for a race, the big fad is these obstacle races, Tough Mudder, Spartan races. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're kind of a boot camp style race where you go and you do a little bit of running, and then you have some obstacle, a wall to climb or a weight to carry or something. And so I signed up with my wife for a Spartan race on the 20th anniversary. And the day I did, kind of one of the iconic obstacles of that race is this rope climb. It's about a 25-foot rope, a little higher than the ceiling. And at the top of the rope, there's this bell that you have to ring that signifies you've accomplished that obstacle and you can move on to the next. You pay a penalty if you don't actually reach the obstacle. So over the next 3 months, my wife and I trained. We trained hard. In fact, we trained 2 and sometimes 3 times a day to prepare for this race. I worked on strength training so I could climb that rope. I really had that rope in mind throughout the entire training period. Race day came, we went with a small group of friends. My wife, she surprised me with a pair of shorts and t-shirt outfit. She said they were cute. She told me to put them on. She said, I confessed to her later that the shorts were too short. But her heart was in the right spot. She gave me a pair of socks too, and she said, I'm giving you these things, she said, because they all wick water. And she said, I don't want your feet to be any heavier than they already are. So her heart was in the right place, so was the hemline was in the right. So we went to the race, we warmed up, we stretched as a group, started the race. And you know, on that day I know that I wasn't the strongest or the fastest runner, but we got about an hour and a half into the race, climbed down to a pit, climbed down something, you know, the pit was about as deep as these stairs. Mud was, you know, low over the knees. My wife, who was with me, grabbed the rope first, and she turned around and she handed it to me. She said, Steve, you can do this. You worked hard. So I grabbed the rope and pulled myself out of the mud, which was part of the hardest part, is getting those first few feet. I got about halfway up. I looked down and I could hear my wife cheering me on. I climbed the remaining half of the rope, and at the top it was pretty muddy from climbers that had been up there before me, and so I kind of felt like my grip was starting to slip a little bit, and so in kind of this moment I just reached up and I smacked the bell. Accomplished my goal. Climbed down the rope. There was my wife. And this time it occurred to me that instead of that face that I was looking at just a few months ago that was in complete fear, frozen, this time it was elated. It was happy. She was full of joy for the accomplishment that I made. And I share that story with patients, not because I think that they have this need to climb a rope and ring bells, because in the truth of the matter, in the scheme of life, Climbing a rope and ringing a bell is kind of a silly little thing. But I know that in their lives they're no different than me. And somewhere in their lives there's these bells that they want to ring. These goals that they want to accomplish. And I want to remind them that it's not one or two things that you do to prepare for reaching these goals, but it's the sum total of all the things that you do that make you successful. Today I share this story with you for a slightly different reason. I want you to hear me tell you that I'm doing everything I can for myself. But the truth of the matter is I'm not fooled. I realize that even though I'm doing everything for myself, it's not enough. And I need your help. And I'm standing here humbly asking you, will you help me? I have other things in my life that I want to accomplish. I need you medical professionals and scientists that are out here to continue to develop products that are effective with minimal side effects so we can tolerate them well. I need you guys in charge of production and quality assurance to make a product that's consistent and stable and safe for me to take. I need you marketing folks and marketing access folks to get the word out there to patients and to physicians saying, hey, we have something that's available that helps you guys. And we have a great network to get it out to you. Executive management, hey guys, I know you got to be worried with the bottom line, and I want you to work hard for the goals of this company, but I also want you to remember that you're helping real patients' lives. And so keep us in focus. You know, these PEP events, I feel like they're some of the most patient-facing things that you do. And I don't want to see them diminished. I'm on the back end of these too, you know. I'm at the support group post-event, and I hear what people say. And I realize the impact that they have on the patients. And I want you to realize it too, because maybe you don't get that view, the view that I get being around other patients. You TBMs, you know, you all have a hard job. You're on the road a lot. You're probably exhausted at times. You have families that you would rather be with. But I want you to know that there's a patient group out there who needs you. So when you keep calling on a neurologist and that neurologist keeps putting you off, I want you to remember sooner or later you will get through to them, and the information that you give them will eventually make a patient's outcome better. So don't give up. Keep trying with them. You know, when I look at you all and the things that you need to do for success, I find that in many ways it's not so much different than what I did. First of all, it starts out with an issue of attitude. And I'm not going to preach to you, but you all know that attitude makes a difference. You know, sometimes companies do things you may not like, sometimes they do things you love. But either way, you've got to perform consistently and with the same attitude. You've got to have happiness, because that happiness is what's going to keep you rejuvenated. It's going to keep you fresh and working hard. In terms of motivation, you know, I realize that some days we don't want to go to work. I work full-time for a hospital. Some days I don't feel so motivated to go to work. And I'm going to concede that you're going to have those days, and I'm not going to probably change those days for you. But if you really have trouble with motivation someday, I want you to remember my words today. I need you. And some days you're dragging into work, but I'm literally dragging. I need you. We talk about other ways of attitude. We talk about relationships. And you know, my wife, she works for a physician. And so when I was preparing for this, I asked her for some input, and I said, what is it that makes the difference between a drug rep getting into a visit to a physician and having some of their time, and what doesn't? And her answer was attitude. She said it's the humble ones, the meek ones, and the nice ones that get in because my doctor only has so much time, and she has no time for arrogance. So as you build your relationships with these front office staff in physician offices, remember that. It's the smile, it's the consistency, it's not the impatience that will get you time with a physician. Healthy lifestyle. You know, for you all, it's no less important. In order for you all to do a good job, you got to do the right things for yourself. You got to have that downtime. You got to do those things that bring passion into your life, including taking care of your health through diet and exercise, or whatever it is that gives you that mental break. I encourage you that if you're not doing that, to take the time to do that. And lastly, ownership. You know, I'm part of the MS family. I fully claim it now. I didn't own it for the longest time. And truthfully, being part of the MS community wasn't my choice. And if I'm going to be real honest with you all, I feel like in many ways being part of the MS community is your choice through your career option. And so if you're going to have ownership in this, I want you to do it right. I want you to have that same passion every day that you did maybe years ago as a youth. You know, that's the wonderful thing about having a son in college is I see how much passion he has. And as we get older, that kind of fades at times, and we lose our passion. We lose our ownership. And so I want to remind you that if you need to make adjustments, they're due. And lastly, I want to remind you, just in case you ever wondered, that you all are not selling snake oil. Right before I started on that medication, I was having relapses every 6 to 8 weeks. I was receiving Solu-Medrol treatments every 6 to 8 weeks. And if you know anything about Solu-Medrol, you know that's too often. And that it's hard on the body. And that it affects bones and joints and all kinds of other things. And since I've been on your medication, I've had 1 relapse in 3 years. So I went from 6 to 8 weeks to 1 in 3 years. That's a medicine that's working. And so I want you to have your heart into it, knowing that I've seen results as a patient. My time's running short, but I want to do a few things. You know, as you all, the TBMs who are out there, as you all work these events, there's a few things I want you to realize that are important to us as patients. When we go to these events, you know, first of all, as patients, we're keen enough to tell the people who care versus people who treat us with indifference. And I haven't really seen that at all. In fact, I haven't seen that at all out of the people I've worked with. But I want to remind you that if there's any hint of it, that we're aware of it. You know, we want to be affirmative in our experiences. And we want you to be bold enough that if we're doing something wrong, something that's not good for our condition, that you be bold enough maybe to coach us. That you tell us what we need to straighten out. And then also remind them, oh, by the way, if you're having trouble with your current medicine, or you're not on medicine and you're making the right decision to start on one, we have a solution for you. We can provide you with the product that you need. I told you about the Bell story, and what I didn't tell you about is when I got out of that mud pit, my son who was filming it, I turned to him and I looked at him, it wasn't planned, but I looked at him and I told him, I said, that was big. Because it was a big moment. And I look into my life and I think that I want so many other big moments. My son, who's in college now, in probably 7 years, will have been out of college, has a job, and he'll be moving into his home. And I want to help him move. I want to have the balance and strength in my legs to be part of that event, that big moment. Lord will, and he'll get married and have a wife. When he has his first child, I want enough arm strength to hold my grandson safely. 20 years from now, I'll be 1 year past retirement. And I hope that I will have had a full career, but I also hope that I'll be sitting on the porch with my wife, looking her in the eyes with enough cognitive ability still to look at her and say, do you remember when? Those are some of my next big moments. Those are what I'm asking you to be a part of. And so when you go out there, as you finish this week with the notion of fueling it up, I want you to remember me. I want you to remember that you contribute to my life, whether you realize it or not. And I'm only one of many. There are so many people out there who need your help. So thank you all very much.